Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. This is the first episode in a video series with Lynne Hardy that promotes the upcoming Rivers of London tabletop role-playing game launch. The book is almost here. It's going to be in people's hands really soon. So this series looks at all kinds of things related to Rivers of London. Why is it such an exciting setting? What does the system of the game do that is unique, and why should you jump into it? This first episode is about urban fantasy in general. What makes this type of storytelling, this type of story, interesting? I started off by asking Lynne to define urban fantasy in a broad sense. Before I jump across to the video, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
In broad strokes, urban fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy novels, which we're all familiar with, but it's one that has usually an urban setting with an overlayer of magic and the unusual.
Can you give me, say, 3 of the most common urban fantasy stories or settings, just so we can get a kind of grounding?
Well, the first one that I came across that is definitely recognizably urban fantasy would be Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere. I saw it first as the TV series, the BBC adaptation, and then I read the novel. And in the same vein, you've also got, therefore, American Gods. Number 2, which is the reason we're doing this video, of course, is the Rivers of London series by Ben Aronovich. And then for the Americans, we've got Jim Butcher's Dresden.
Is there any kind of main touchstones or reoccurring themes or overarching messages that tend to appear in urban fantasy more than other genres of fantasy?
From my experience, it kind of tends to break down into 2 camps. You've got your young adult urban fantasy, which tends to be this. There tends to be some mystery element to it, but it's often more to do with relationships and people figuring out who they are as because they're teenagers or young adults. You tend to get a lot of murder mysteries that have this urban fantasy rooted in the real world, but magic and weird creatures involving. So obviously, Neverwhere, American Gods, the Dresden Files, Rivers of London. Paul Cornell, who's also a Doctor Who writer like Ben, did a series as well, but at the moment the name of that series escapes me. So you tend to find that a lot of the more adult focused ones tend to be police procedurals, murder mysteries, with this really heavy overlay of magic and strange beings, and the strange beings having their own world, which is clashing with the real world to some extent. And then you have your protagonist who usually has a foot in both camps. So they're tied to the real world, and either they stumble across the magical world and get dragged into it, which is what happens to Peter Grant in Rivers of London and the main character in Neverwhere, or they're part of it, they're born part of it, but they may not necessarily know that from the offing. And it's them trying to navigate their way through the mystery and their lives, not really belonging to either.
Where does the line get drawn? If I talk about, say, a series of books that is maybe a mystery series first, or a crime series that might have just the tiniest bit of fantastical element, or maybe something like the Fear Index, which is a financial crime novel, but that takes place with a little bit of sci-fi thrown in. Or if I talk about something like the Laundry Files, which is very urban fantasy, magical creatures and all that, but has this layer of espionage over the whole thing. Is the genre broad enough to encompass everything, or is there something special that makes something an urban fantasy story?
I think it's pretty broad. I mean, it's like most fictional genres, there is a huge amount of bleed between them. So as long as it is set in a real world setting with this element of magic put over the top, all these strange creatures added to it, it kind of fits. But then, it's one of these perennial arguments as to what is exactly a genre. It's like the steampunk argument. What is steampunk? And, you can argue till you're blue in the face about what it is. But basically, if you think it belongs in that genre, it probably does.
Lynne, you missed the perfect opportunity to say you can argue until steam comes out your ears. I'm trying.
Oh, may you be forgiven.
So what makes urban fantasy special? Why is it so exciting? And why were you drawn to it so much for the Rivers of London series?
All all of us, I think, deep down, particularly those of us who love reading books and using books as an escape from every day, kind of hope that there is magic in the world somewhere. A lot of us grew up on fantasy books. A lot of us, particularly living in England and Britain and traveling all over Britain, there's an awful lot of folklore and history all around you. So there's always that, I suppose, hoping and longing that there is something more to life than just plain old boring mundanity, really. I like a good mystery. I love my Sherlock Holmes. I love my Agatha Christie, various other authors as well. So having that fantasy element collide with something that I was already very fond of was the perfect mix for me. And the Rivers of London series gripped me because you have that wonderful sense of humor that Ben has. You have the nicely crafted mysteries, but you've also got that slightly different, interesting take on British folklore and fantasy because it's got those African influences on it in terms of the Genii Locorum for the rivers. And that was just something really nice. It uses existing fantasy tropes, but it twists them ever so slightly.
It's funny that you said that escapism is such an important part of urban fantasy, considering that it tends to be set in the same kind of real world locations that people live in. So it draws you back into the real world. Doesn't that stop you from getting a good escapist fantasy?
No, I don't think it does. Certainly not from my perspective. There's an interesting thing that you want different, but you don't want too different. So it being set somewhere that you vaguely know is comforting, but having that weird overlay of magic gives it that slight thrill of danger and intrigue, which makes it interesting. And it is nice, sort of like reading about the different places in Rivers of London that I know I've been to and going, oh, I recognize that. So that familiarity I think also helps you engage with it in a way that the weird stuff does too, because it's just that little bit different and intriguing.
So do you see Rivers of London as a typical entry in the urban fantasy suites, the urban fantasy genre, or do you think that it is doing something really unique?
I think it's a great entry point into urban fantasy, particularly if you do like your murder mysteries and your police procedurals. Um, if that's not the thing that you're into, then there may well be other better entry points. But again, I think it's that sense of humor, the fact that it doesn't take itself too seriously, the fact that there are some gritty, grim bits in there, but it's not the entire focus of the book. All the series means that it's a lot more accessible. I don't like my murder mysteries to be too brutal and nasty, if that makes sense. So I'm not a fan of serial killer novels. I'm not or necessarily a fan of psychological thrillers either, because they tend to be genuinely deeply disturbing and really quite nasty. Although Ben does like to have one really gruesome murder in per book at least, because he has a group of fans that he likes to call the gruesome grannies, and they do like to have something ick at least once per book.
Yeah, a couple of key scenes jumped out at me when you said, "Oh, I don't like my mysteries that gruesome." But there we go.
Yeah, no, there are a couple of really quite horrendous bits which sort of like really slap you hard because they are that step one further than the rest of the sort of like the tone. But it's just like how a good horror film often has elements of comedy in there to give you that breathing space. I think the way Ben uses some of the more gruesome crimes is that just stops you and pulls you up and makes you think, oh, hang on, no, this isn't all just fun and games. There is this very serious element that needs sorting out and fixing.
So one of the most famous urban fantasy tabletop role-playing games has got to be Vampire the Masquerade. Hell, the entire World of Darkness suite fits in that world so fantastically. Where does Rivers of London do something different? How is it going to compare to something like Vampire the Masquerade for players who might have experience with that and want to try out more urban fantasy role-playing?
It's a very different take, obviously, because primarily, at least in the core rules, you're playing a human. You have, or you you have the option to have been affected by magic, to be part of the Demimonde, because the way Rivers of London is set up is the fact that people who have been touched or affected or changed by magic in some way are part of this large group known as the Demimonde, even if they're humans. So people like Peter Grant and Thomas Nightingale are part of the Demimonde because they are Newtonian practitioners. They can use magic, they can cast spells. There are others, sort of like members of the Fae, like Zachary Palmer and the Quiet People when they come in, the actual High Fae, all of those sorts of people. And there's others as well. And it's a very sort of loose collective term. So in this game, yes, you have the option to be part of the Demimonde, to have been drawn into the Demimonde, but you can still be human. You're not going to be playing vampires. Vampires work very differently in Rivers of London to the way that they do in Vampire the Masquerade. Although if you are a more confident role player, we do give you the option to create what we call lower fae. So the ones who can get away with living in the real world more easily and don't tend to get noticed.
I have been reading the Rivers of London books recently, so a lot of what you said made sense to me. It also occurred to me that somebody watching this video might have gone, Newtonian practitioner? Fae? Is this a fairy thing? What the heck is a quiet person? How much do I need to know? Can I jump in and have just your standard kind of archetypal urban fantasy adventure without really having to dive into Rivers of London?
Yes, I mean that the whole pitch when we first put this forward was that at most we would have expected people to have read the first book, which is Rivers of London in Britain and Midnight Riot in the US. But not even expecting that. So we give you the background to the world. We explain a lot of the terms that I've just mentioned. So magicians in Britain, at least, are called Newtonian practitioners because Sir Isaac Newton formulated the system of magic that British practitioners, i.e. wizards, use. If you're not a Newtonian practitioner, you are a hedge wizard, which is a slightly dismissive term that you would sort of expect from the upper class gentry types who were doing this in the 18th century. So, we try to explain all of that because, as I said, at most we were expecting people to have read the first book and nothing more.
So when it comes to urban fantasy as a role player, if I'm looking into the Rivers of London role playing game, I want to explore it and I want to explore the genre more broadly. What kind of themes, adventures, stories should I be looking for as a player or as a GM if this book is right for me?
In many ways, Rivers of London builds on what we did with Call of Cthulhu. And Call of Cthulhu is so accessible because it is set in the real world, which makes finding locations and developing stories actually slightly easier because there is that familiarity. There's a lot that you don't have to explain to your players because they kind of already know it. And we do give you the option to actually create your own branch of the folly in the core rules if you'd rather not be playing in London and you want to set it somewhere that you're more familiar with. So that makes your job a lot easier. And again, it's the same sort of trick that we use. Well, certainly the trick that I use with Call of Cthulhu is you can use local folklore, local weird stuff, local ghost sightings, you name it, to help you create plots. And we give you some advice on that in the book too.
Here's a tricky question. Is H.P. Lovecraft and cosmic horror, is that urban fantasy or is it science fiction?
That's probably more cosmic horror, and it's off on its own little. I mean, although Ben does describe Rivers of London as Call of Cthulhu now with added hope, so every field of literature feeds into all the other fields of literature. We're all magpies. We all pick and choose bits that we like from all over the place. And trying to narrowly define something is, it's always, I suppose, the road to hell, really, because you're never going to do it and nobody's ever going to agree with you. So, if you think it's urban fantasy, great, you enjoy it. That's your urban fantasy. Good for you.
Do you have any final words on the genre or why this game, as an example of the genre, is going to be so exciting for everybody to pick up?
Ben's world is very rich and it has interesting twists. And I think for people who like investigative games. It's just that something slightly different to what they're used to with Call of Cthulhu. If they love the novels, it's their chance to play in that world. So I think it's got a lot going for it, whatever direction you're coming from. I know we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. It was like, is urban fantasy sort of like a self-insert mechanism for some of the authors? And I don't necessarily think that's true. I think you might have been reading a little bit too much into that, Jamie. But there is absolutely nothing to stop players from creating magical versions of themselves. There are numerous examples of that in sort of urban fantasy trope. I mean, if we're going to extend it out to Doctor Who, the Love and Monsters episode, they are normal people who have met the Doctor and their lives have been touched, as long as you turn it off 5 minutes before the end, because let's not talk about the ending of that thing. So why not? If you ever fancied seeing yourself in the Rivers of London world, why not create a version of yourself that casts magic? Once you have the book and it's your game, it's up to you to do what you want with it. And if you want to have you and your friends running around your locale, solving local folklore mysteries, casting spells in the Newtonian system, that would be absolutely wonderful. And I hope you have a fantastic time doing it.